very warm welcome to the Global Sports Channel today to Mr. Phil Wishart. Phil, how are you today?
I'm good, thanks. Thanks for having me on. Really
Yeah,
exciting to be here.
well, it's great, and we were just talking offline, and you and I met a number of years ago. In fact, I can't even remember how long ago it was, and do you have any idea?
I want to say about 2012, perhaps, or 11. Probably back
2000.
then.
Wow, it was 8 years ago, wasn't it?
Yeah,
It's
time flies.
it certainly does, and well, we've both been on a bit of a journey since then, haven't we?
Yeah, absolutely. Looks like your journey's still going on the plate there.
Yeah, well, we're kicking off this sports thing, and it's really great to have you on the show. So thanks very much for taking time out. Can you tell all the listeners and viewers around the world whereabouts are you today? Where are you chatting to us from?
I'm based up on the sunny central coast of New South Wales, which is just about an hour north of Sydney in Australia. So we've been working from home during COVID over the last 6 months, and my wife and I took the opportunity to move back to the central coast where we grew up, and still able to commute to Sydney for work when we get back to the office stage. But no, really nice, just down the road from the beach, and luckily it's a sunny day today, so hopefully get out for a surf later this afternoon.
Beautiful, fantastic. So I was going to ask you about that because you were talking to me offline about your basketball efforts in the last 24 hours or so. Are you a keen sportsman in general? Do you have a lot of sports that you're involved in?
Yeah, I grew up playing heaps of different sports. My mum threw me into so many different sports to try, and we travelled all across New South Wales and Australia playing in a whole range of sports. I took up basketball, played a bit of football or soccer in my junior years, and still play the odd bit of five-a-side now. And then I guess as I grew up, went to sailing in high school, just locally on dinghy sailing, and then in my older years, in my career, I've been into mountain biking and taken up surfing over the last few years, which is a lot easier on the body. But yeah, to get back to basketball last night for the first time in about 5 years, and I think I was good for about 5 minutes, and it was all over after that.
Well, it sounds like you've got a real portfolio of different sports that you've been involved in. Is there one that stands out for you that you're more passionate about than the others?
I think from a participation point of view, I'm really enjoying surfing because it's a new skill, and sitting out the back watching these kids that learn it when they're so young, I wish I'd had that experience. I never really got into it, so that's been really good. I really like those nature-based activities, surfing, mountain biking. It's just a chance where you can switch off from technology and go out and enjoy yourself, and it is a bit of a challenge. But yeah, enjoy the team sports as well. I think basketball was my passion growing up, and I refereed. That was sort of my predominant hobby growing up, and so I think for me, basketball is probably the team sport that I enjoy the most.
Right, cool. So when you do these sports, do you have kind of figures that you look up to on either national or an international level that are kind of role models? And do you follow teams like you said you played football? Do you follow a football team in particular over the years?
Yeah, since the A-League started about 13 years ago, I think I supported the Central Coast Mariners. So growing up, that was the local team and the first professional club in our region as well. We don't have any rugby league clubs or rugby clubs that are professional. So, yeah, I love the Central Coast Mariners. They haven't had many great seasons over the past 5 years, but did have a lot of success towards the start of the competition.
And we can't forget the Central Coast Mariners because there was one Jamaican athlete that came over and made them pretty famous, yeah? And Usain Bolt had a go. What happened there in the end?
Yeah, so Usain Bolt decided he wanted to play football and came over to trial for the Mariners at the start of last season. He had a couple of games of pre-season, did bag 2 goals in one of the games, but unfortunately didn't get a contract. I think the salary he might have been looking for was probably a bit outside the window of the Mariners. Unfortunately, we couldn't lock it down, but they didn't have their best season last year, so who knows, if he'd been playing, maybe we would have got some better results. But yeah, it was really exciting. I think there was about 10,000 people at a pre-season game, which is probably as big as some of the crowds we've had during regular season. And so that was really exciting for the coast and a lot of hype. And he really enjoyed his time on the Central Coast too. He was promoting and loved the lifestyle. So for any other international athletes thinking of coming out, it was a very good endorsement of the Central Coast.
Yeah, that's a very good plug, and for someone who's followed Usain Bolt's career right from its beginning to see him ending up on the Central Coast and having a go at doing that in the football, it was a bit of a bit of a strange one out of left field, really. You know, the guy's on his Instagram page promoting Manchester United like crazy and going over there. He's got a lot of friends in the UK, of course. So it was a bit strange seeing him ending up on the Central Coast, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think if you said to anyone on the Central Coast in a couple of years' time, Usain Bolt will be coming in and play for your club, we all would have laughed at you, especially off the back of the Olympics. But I think he's reached the peak of his career in track and field, and it's a great opportunity for him to try something new. And I think he realised it was probably really tough to crack a football team. I think the A-League's a well-respected league around the world, but even just that pre-season training, it's a very long pre-season out here. So I think that was a bit of an eye-opener for him, but who knows what he'll do next. He's been good at everything he's done so far, so I have no doubt we'll see him pop up somewhere else.
Yeah, absolutely. And it probably could have been one of those situations where the Australian federal government should have stepped in and helped with the budget, because it would have been a great tourism opportunity to have him doing advertisements for Australia and everything, right?
Yeah, I think even the A-League, I know they've got their marquee player salary over here for the national competition, and I think they would have loved to have had him, but I think the football community was really split, to be honest. Half of them thought it was great for the game because it grew the game and it was great to promote Australia and New South Wales and the Mariners. And then the other half, the football purists, thought that athletes shouldn't just be able to walk in because they were good at one sport. So it was quite an interesting dynamic here in the media, and I think internationally as to how it played out. But for the time that he was here, I think all of that organic media, and I know Central Coast Council tried to work really closely with him to promote the region, and yeah, I think we've got stunning locations, so it wasn't that hard for him to get out and take photos of the beach and show everyone what a great time he was having.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic, that, because, if you and I are working in the business world, we can change jobs and go to different professions and no one says anything about it. But if a sportsman decides to take on a different discipline, all of a sudden they become useless and no good at it and they can't succeed. But that's to the contrary. There's been lots of examples around the world. You've only got to look at the Olympic Games. It's full of people that have done different disciplines, gone back and won different medals in different disciplines. Anyway, we could talk about that all day. So thanks for sharing that part of Central Coast Mariners history with Usain Bolt. That's interesting stuff. Now, the other reason I wanted to have you on the show today, because you do a very interesting job, and a lot of our listeners and viewers around the world really probably don't understand what's behind what you do. So why don't I stop there and just ask you to introduce what you actually do for a living and how long you've been doing it for?
Yeah, so I work for the New South Wales Government Office of Sport, which is a state government agency. Here in Australia, we have federal government, we have state governments, and then we have local councils as well. So state government is that middle level. But they operate fairly autonomously, I guess, in terms of how we're structured. My roles at the Office of Sport over the last couple of years, I was the principal advisor for major sports events, and my role was predominantly looking at bidding for World Cup and major events, and then also looking at the legacy we can derive from those major events. So looking at what the playing outcomes and the sport development outcomes were for when we're hosting a World Championships or a World Cup event. And we were really lucky in 2018, the Premier announced that the New South Wales government would bid for 10 World Cups in 10 years, which is between 2019 and 2029. So we've been pretty busy. We've secured 8 of those World Cups, and we've a couple of those already in 2019 and 2020. This year's been a little bit quieter, obviously, with COVID-19. And then over the last 6 months, I've moved into a communications and marketing role, heading up our comms and marketing team over COVID, which has been a lot of crisis communications, as you can appreciate, and try and work with our sector to help them get back on their feet, because all levels of sport have stopped for a period of time, whether that's community sport and people going out and having a kick or going for a run, all the way up to our professional leagues, which have been able to recommence gradually over time. And it's great to see community sport back out here and a little bit more normality over the next couple of months.
Yeah, brilliant. We're going to talk a little bit about the COVID situation a little bit later on in the show, but I wanted to go back to this phenomenon that you've got in terms of attracting major events. A lot of people around the world won't understand how that process actually unfolds. So can you tell us about how you go about securing some of these major events? Is there a tendering process? How many years before these events take place do these things get locked down and all that sort of thing? Because I think the process is really interesting to understand.
Yeah, sure. So every process is slightly different, but I guess as a state government agency, we have to work with the national sporting bodies. So, in the case of basketball, we've got the FIBA Women's World Cup coming to Sydney in 2022. So we need to work with Basketball Australia, who work with the international federation. So in that case, FIBA. The bidding process really differs in time frame. So we've been working or starting to work on the Men's Rugby World Cup bid for 2027. We started conversations about that last year, and the bidding process, I believe, starts next year. So that's one that's 7 or 8 years of work to go through the bid process, about 8 or 9 years out. And then we also then have to work on delivering all the things that we have promised as a government or the national bodies promised as they establish a local organising committee. So our role at the Office of Sport is to work with our colleagues across government, so Destination New South Wales with our Tourism and Events Agency, and then also our other government agencies, police, emergency services, Department of Premier and Cabinet, Transport, to look at what we need to deliver as a government agency, so making sure people can get to the games. We're very fortunate in New South Wales. We own and manage a lot of the stadia that events are played in, so working with our venue partners to make sure we've got the facilities to play in and they're at the standard they need. And then we work with the national body to put forward the best bid that we can to secure the event for either New South Wales or Sydney or the regional locations that we're hosting the events. Or in the case of an event where it's multi-jurisdictional, like the FIFA Women's World Cup bid, which is being played across Australia and New Zealand, we have to work with the other states and with our federal government counterparts to make sure that we put together the best holistic bid. And it's going to be a great tournament experience for people coming, no matter what city they're playing in or what state they're playing in.
Lots of questions to come out of that lot. The first one is, it's such a long lead-in time, isn't it? You know, when you're talking about 7 or 8 years, is it difficult to keep a team together for that period of time that's consistent across the whole thing? As you talked about, you've got so many different stakeholders. I would imagine that, you know, some people are moving on to new roles and new jobs and the team's constantly changing. Is that a battle?
Yeah, it can be. I think in the state government, we find that there are people that have been in event roles for a long time because we don't specifically get involved in the local organising committee operations. They're set up as a separate company to deliver the event. We provide that support role. So in our government sphere, we've got people that have that event experience dating back to the Sydney 2000 Olympics and have continued on in event roles and different roles across government as well. I think for local organising committees, they do bring in contract workers, and what we see in that industry is that people go from event to event. So they might work on a Commonwealth Games, for example, on the Gold Coast in 2018, and then they'll move on to a World Championships in Sydney, and then they might work into the Olympic cycle. And so you do see a lot of event contractors. And then within your national federations, you do see a bit of movement. So staff that may move on into different roles or they move across sporting organisations. So sometimes that can be a challenge to realise the vision that you set out to put forward when you bid for an event, especially so many years out, if those people aren't still there. And we have a lot of conversations within our office around transferring knowledge and understanding what the vision was, so that when we're thinking about the operational requirements as a government, or we're talking with a local organising committee who may not have even been established when we bid for an event, we have to take them on the journey of where we've come from in the initial conversations we've had. So it is really important to make sure we share that knowledge with all the stakeholders that we're involved in along the way, so that they buy into that vision, and we also ensure that we're delivering what we promised.
So what happens when there's actually a change in the government and a new government comes in through that process, through that cycle that you're talking about? Is it a thing that the event has to go ahead regardless of whatever government's in power, or can the government actually say, hey, we don't actually want to do this and support it, and they can actually stop the event process from going forward?
It depends on where the contracting is up to. So technically any government, when they change, have the right to make their minds up and go in a different direction. We're fairly lucky in Australia that we have fairly stable governments, and when we do change parties, government appreciates that a lot of those commitments, whether it's in the event space or in terms of infrastructure builds, are able to continue on. So in the event space, I think we haven't really seen many situations, or any that I can think of, where a government's come out and cancelled due to a change in party or political views. I think throughout COVID, we've probably seen a few changes, but that's probably been more related to restrictions being placed on governments in terms of public health orders, and also budget situations, and that's something we've seen across the world. So we're probably seeing now at the moment that some events that were secured 5-6 years ago, some governments across the world aren't able to be in a position to help deliver those events just due to their financial situation or as a result of the pandemic. So those events are going back out to market and looking for new hosts. And one of the benefits of Australia is we're very experienced at delivering events. We've got great expertise and people that are known around the world for their event expertise. And we also are a stable environment for the most part. So we're seen as a safe pair of hands when people bring tournaments to Australia. And I think that's what international federations like. They like that when Australia or New South Wales say they're going to do something, we always will pull through and get it done. So they're not worrying that 5 years down the track we're going to pull out at the last minute. So that's one of the benefits of our country.
Yeah, right. Now, you talked about the very high success rate you've had of bringing on some of these world events. Let's go back to Sydney 2000, because I'm sure that event and the success of that event really put Australia sports, but also sports event management on the map, like you've just been talking about. How much has that played into the success of bringing some of these other events online, do you think?
Oh, I think Sydney 2000 left a huge legacy for hosting events and also putting Sydney on the stage as a global city. It really put Sydney on the map. It was front of people's minds. Obviously, in Olympics and any mega event like that, you get so much worldwide coverage. And I think we've benefited from a tourism point of view that people want to go to Sydney. They want to get their photo under the Harbour Bridge or next to the Opera House. They want to be here when something's going on the harbour in terms of fireworks or a big celebration on the harbour, because they saw those shots from Sydney. But the other legacy we have is the infrastructure legacy and that event expertise legacy. So we have some great stadia, not only ANZ or Stadium Australia, where the opening ceremony and the athletics were held. We've got a lot of world-class facilities that can host international events and national events that have been kept up to a great standard. And I think that's one of the legacies that Sydney has that a lot of other Olympic cities don't have. If you look at some of the vision from Sochi, for example, or Athens or Rio, you've got facilities that are in ruins or they're not being used. We still use so many of our Olympic venues, especially at Sydney Olympic Park. That venue still gets over 1 million people through it on a regular basis. It's really grown into a residential area, but the sporting facilities are at a standard that we can basically drop in our world championships with very minimal overlay because those venues are still up to a great standard. So that's one of the real legacies. And I think having a pipeline of events is really important as well. So we had the Sydney 2000 Olympics, we had the Rugby World Cup in 2003, we had the World Masters Games in 2009, a massive multi-sport participation event. We then went on, we've had the Invictus Games, we've had the Rugby League World Cups, Cricket World Cups, the T20 Women's World Cup earlier this year. And we've seen the upgrade to the tennis centre to host the new ATP Cup men's tennis tournament. So having that pipeline of events encourages governments to invest. It also demonstrates to the world that we're ready to go and we've maintained.
Yeah, I'm glad you talked about the legacy side of it, because I've been fortunate enough to go to a number of Olympics around the world, and Athens is one in particular that steps out of my mind, because I went there for the games and then I went back a few years later, and it was heart destroying really to see weeds growing out of the stadium and basically cactus plants and the whole thing just being left to ruins, as you mentioned. And I think what we, as the general public, hear a lot of the time is that prior to these big events taking place and the pitch process going into effect, we hear about representatives saying, this is going to create jobs afterwards, this is going to create tourism, this stadium's going to be fantastic for local sports and all the rest of it. And it sounds to me like New South Wales has got it together in being able to actually deliver on those promises, but that's not always the case. Why do you think that happens? Is it just a lack of real commitment around the sustainability factor, or why does New South Wales do it so good?
I think probably the best, it's hard to explain. I think Sydney was well thought through about what the venues were going to be used for after the Olympics. And you take the Office of Sport where I work, for example, we manage 3 of the Olympic venues that aren't based in Sydney Olympic Park. So the Regatta Centre for the rowing and canoeing, the Equestrian Centre and the Shooting Centre. I think that when we built those venues, we thought about how they were going to be used post-event. So we didn't go and build huge grandstands. We bumped those grandstands in at event time. But that means that post-event, we're able to run a whole range of events, whether that's a community event. So we have community shooting clubs coming into the shooting centre and using them every day. We have regatta training and rowing training out on the lake. And this year, our 3 venues are actually on track to record their busiest ever years before COVID hit in terms of events. And that's because they can scale up to really big events, but also when they're just in normal operation mode, they can be used by the community and local clubs. I think some cities look to build to the spec that the major event organisers want, so they put in permanent grandstands or permanent facilities, and they realise that that's not financially sustainable in the long term. And it's not sustainable because you're not going to put major events in there year in, year out. So I think we're starting to see a model now where even those international rights holders, your IOCs, your Commonwealth Games federations, acknowledge that, and they're looking for solutions where there is a legacy long term. So if you don't think about the legacy of your event in the first case, right when you're going through the bid process, it's really hard to retrofit it moving forward. And so we make sure that conversation around legacy and what we want to get out of hosting an event beyond the economic benefit at the time or the job creation at the time, we look at what we want the benefit to be a few years down the track. In the lead up to the event as well, you can do pre-event legacy in terms of developing the sport as you go along, and looking at how your infrastructure is going to be utilised if you do have to invest in infrastructure. So they're probably the key areas where Sydney and New South Wales has done really well off the back of the Olympics. I think London's another good example that did it really well. They probably got the Olympics back on track in terms of that infrastructure legacy and the precinct they've got out there at Stratford.
Now, the other thing is that often these really big events like the Olympics, they're actually a multi-dimensional and multicultural event as well as far as the organisation. I've met a lot of people who literally travel the Olympic roadshow around the world from the organisation point of view, and that must help because you learn things, right, and you bring new ideas and you bring lessons learned. Was that a case around Sydney as well? Were there people from overseas that were involved in working on that project?
Yeah, there was. There was a really broad range of people that came to Sydney for the Olympics. But I think we also did a really good job in terms of developing Australian expertise. And following that, we saw a lot of Australians exported out to major events. But I think that's really important. It's a global event. There's so many different cultures coming together. Unless you have a global workforce and a multicultural workforce and a diverse workforce, your event just won't be successful because the way that the sporting public and the audience interacts with an event is so different depending on what culture you're coming from or what country you're coming from. So I think that's really important. When you look at broadcasting, the International Broadcast Centre at those types of events, it's just a melting pot of different cultures and they all want different stories. So the way Australia did Roy and HG for the Dream at the Sydney 2000, it was a comedy show, it took the piss, it was very Australian and the international athletes had never seen that before, but they loved it. They wanted to be there, and it was showing that Aussie humour, whereas when you go to another country, it's shown in a completely different way by the broadcaster. So that's one example. I think the way that events are delivered, obviously, you've got some sports that are really well followed in America, for example, so they've got a lot of expertise in how to deliver those sports so that it's the best result for the spectators and the broadcasters and the athletes. So that expertise may come from there. Australia may have expertise in another sport, and so expertise comes from there. So that's really important. And I think London probably, again, going back to it, reinvigorated that. I think we've seen that travelling workforce off the back of Sydney 2000 for 16 to 20 years, and then London reinvigorated that. So we've now seen a lot of English expats that are going on that sort of Olympics roadshow and World Cups roadshow as well, and they're going back into Birmingham for their Commonwealth Games. So they've been able to sustain that with some major events in their own country to keep that workforce active.
Yeah, cool. Now, I know there's probably thousands of people listening and watching this show who are thinking right now, I would love to do this as a job. So is it how difficult is it to get into being part of this roadshow?
I think in the events industry, at the moment, it's really difficult, and I know we're going to touch on COVID later. In a normal cycle, I think it starts with just putting yourself out there and getting experience. A lot of jobs in events when you're starting out aren't well paid, so it's really about the love of the role that you're going for. And there's lots of volunteer opportunities, and I think we see volunteers who are on the volunteering circuit and they've got expertise, and then they're able to shift into paid roles, and then they can move their way up the ladder. Um, I think with so many events on in so many different countries and lots of them happening simultaneously, there is plenty of opportunities. I think in government, in our space, it's probably a little bit tighter because we do see people, as I said, who have remained in government roles and shifted across departments and maintained that expertise. One of the challenges in the events industry, I find, is you've really got to be willing to travel and uproot your life on those cycles. I haven't fortunately had to do that. I haven't worked on international events before. All of mine have been based pretty close to home and based in New South Wales. But people will often travel over 3 years in an Olympic city, and then they'll go on to the Commonwealth Games, and then you've really got to be prepared to uproot your life. So for single people, that's really great. And, it's a fantastic lifestyle because you meet lots of people. But for people with families, I think you find that you do that for 3, 4 years or even up to a decade. And then you do get to a point where you want to settle down and look at roles that are in your own state. And that's what's great about our pipeline of World Cup events. We've now got great international events on home soil that people can work through over the next 10 years, which is fantastic. So there'll be job opportunities coming up, and it also gives some of our people that are working in national sports organisations and state sports organisations a flavour of working on a world event, whereas they might not have had that opportunity for themselves overseas.
Yeah, good advice. And I've got a little bit of a story I can share with you and it happened on the New South Wales coast, actually. It was many years ago. I went to the Ironman race at Foster Tuncurry there, and I was down there early in the morning before the start of the race, and I bumped into a volunteer organiser, and we were having a chat about how he got involved in helping out the Ironman organisation there. And then, lo and behold, a couple of years later, I bumped into the same guy in Kona in Hawaii at the World Championships. And he'd basically progressed all the way through and ended up working for the governing body at a global level after starting off as a volunteer in Foster Tuncurry. Yeah? So it just shows that, as you said, get in on the ground. And you never know where you might end up in the world of sports as far as that goes if you're passionate about it. And I think passion drives a lot of that. Let's go back to the Basketball World Cup, because I'm interested to know when you get the green light and you've been successful in winning a bid like that, how many other countries are involved in the process, and what is the process like? Does everybody submit their bid and then there's a short list, and what's actually the process of winning a bid like that?
Yeah, again, it differs for lots of different sports. So we've had events that we've bid for where we've been up against lots of nations, and then we've had events where it's also been a direct negotiation. In the case of the FIBA Women's Basketball World Cup, they went out for expressions of interest from across all of their nations. So they've got about over 200 nations that are affiliated with FIBA. And then it came down to two nations that submitted, so ourselves and Russia. So Russia's a very strong nation in women's basketball, and obviously in Central Europe, it's got good proximity to broadcasts and time zones and access for players to come in. So what happened from there is we submitted initial bid work working with Basketball Australia. FIBA then came out and did technical site inspections of both venues, so both cities, I should say, or countries. So they came out to Russia, had a look at there, and then they came to Sydney. We were quite lucky. I think we heard a story from them that I think they were in minus 40 degrees standing outside looking at a venue that was going to be built in the future, and then they came to Sydney 2 days later and it was 30 degrees and sunny. So yeah, I think they got to have a quick trip via Bondi, and they got to see the Harbour Bridge in all its glory as the sunset. So it was quite nice for us to be able to showcase that when they came out and show them that we've already got venues that are built. In the case of the FIFA Women's World Cup, it was quite a similar process for the football. You had to submit an expression of interest, and this year they made their process the same as the men's bidding process, so it came down to a vote, whereas previously it's all been done a bit more behind closed doors. But there was record interest. They had 8 expressions of interest in that initial phase, and then they called for the formal bids. 4 countries submitted, so there was ourselves with New Zealand, Brazil, Colombia, and Japan. And then along the way, FIFA actually reviewed those bid documents, provided advice and feedback back to the nations, and we saw a few nations drop out along the way. So we saw Japan drop out in the week of the bid, just due to the Olympics and the postponement there. We saw Brazil drop out. They just didn't think their chances would be that great. I think there was still a few financial concerns around funding that tournament. And so that came down to Australia and Colombia. Whereas some of the other events, we've had some direct negotiations because Australia's been the first preference to host the event. So the ATP Cup is a concept that Tennis Australia had been working on. So they were essentially the rights holders for that event with the ATP. So we knew the event was coming to Australia, and then it was just about us bidding against other states for content within that bid. So, yeah, that's a bit of a summary. Each of them are slightly different in terms of how they work, and sometimes we're bidding against other states, sometimes we're working with states, and we always have to work with the national federations regardless of what we're bidding for.
Yeah, it's an interesting process, and you laugh about the team that came out and had their beautiful scenic tour of Sydney, but that's an important part of it as well, because they see it through the eyes of a tourist that will come to the event as well, and they can see what the tourist is going to experience, and it's all part of the total experience as well. Shame on the guys in Russia for not turning on some warm weather, but it's beyond their control. One of the questions around that, I guess that's a little bit more serious that I want to ask you, is the Russian Federation in sports has had some troubles in the last couple of years, particularly at the Olympic level. Do you think those kinds of things play on the minds of some of these bid outcomes?
Yeah, I think the politics around international sporting federations, it definitely weighs on the mind of people when they're making decisions. So in the case of Russia, which potentially could have had world events stripped off them if they're found to be guilty and go through that process, I think that's definitely a risk. And when you're assessing bid, you want a low risk option. So you want a safe pair of hands, as I said earlier, minimal controversy or likelihood of controversy, because a lot can happen over that period between the time that you win the bid and the time that you deliver the event. So, yeah, there's a whole range of considerations that go in. Obviously, financial considerations is one as well. So people obviously want to make money out of events. So that's something to consider. But that reputational risk of delivering an event or having an event cancelled due to an unstable political environment or a misdemeanor is something that I think international federations would definitely consider when they're looking at bids.
Yeah, right. Okay. Now, I want to share something with you. This is something you don't know about me, but a number of years ago, I put together a document that I sent to the International Olympic Committee about the possibility of having an Olympic Games in a country like Cambodia. And my emphasis there was that I feel as though all of the things that something like an Olympic Games can bring a country, a developing nation like Cambodia, an enormous amount of benefits, and which I outlined in the document that I submitted to the International Olympic Committee. What are your thoughts around something like that in terms of some of these major events should be put into, African countries where the infrastructure is not there yet, but by having these events take place, it's going to help these countries to develop. It's going to bring investment in. It's going to bring expertise in. Are you somebody that would support that kind of thing?
I think it's a very fine balance. I think we talked earlier about some of your global cities like Athens and Rio that have hosted these events, and that infrastructure has just been left to ruin, essentially. I think it's really important that you've got to have a scalable option where you're hosting events, and it may not be an Olympics or a World Championships that's suitable for a developing nation or a nation that doesn't have the infrastructure at this point in time. But looking at some of those confederational championships and events, that they're really important. I know in the Pacific, for example, there's been lots of Pacific Games and Oceania Championships and Junior World Championships that have been able to be hosted in those nations because the infrastructure and the resourcing is scalable. So I think that's really important that you can bring in and build that infrastructure and expertise within a country or a city. But you need to make sure that when you leave that city that you're not just going to have all these white elephant assets sitting there that aren't being used or expertise that can't go on to something else. So, yeah, I think it is a fine balance. I think it would be really tough to deliver an Olympics in Cambodia. We're finding it's tough at the moment just to deliver Olympics in major cities just due to the congestion, but also the requirements and the costs associated with it. And so I know that there's been talks around looking at regionalised models, so whether a major event can be held across multiple countries, or an event that can be held across multiple cities or countries, how that would work. What do you do with your athletes' village to make sure that you're not just building accommodation that's not going to be used anymore? So I think there are all the considerations you do need to think about. And I think those major entities like your IOCs and FIFA and Commonwealth Games federations are thinking about that in terms of, how do they take major events, but not leave a negative legacy where they've just built a lot of infrastructure and, trained up a lot of people that now can't find work post-event.
Yeah, interesting. I think there's, obviously with any topic, there's lots of different ways to look at it. And one of the things that I did to overcome what you're talking about in my proposal was talking to some of the aid agencies around the world, in particular, that put hundreds of millions of dollars a year into a place like Cambodia, and how that money gets used, how sustainable are the outcomes of that funding that goes in there. Cambodia is an interesting country because it has such a large population under the age of 50. A lot of the people are young because of the genocide and what happened there. And there's all sorts of infrastructural requirements that they don't have today that something like this could fast track. So I think it's we live in a disruptive world, don't we? We're using taxis in different ways than we ever did before. We're getting around cities on scooters and electric scooters and all this sort of thing. So I think there's a natural progression to happen, and maybe you're right. Maybe there's an opportunity to have a second or third tier major event in some of these countries and build up to something more significant. Let's get back to New South Wales in particular. When you're doing some of these large events, I'm a very proud New Zealander. We have a great sporting heritage. And we also like working with our cousins across here in Australia. So is there an opportunity, and do you do it, where you look at New Zealand as being a partner in some of these major events and sharing the pleasures, I guess?
Yeah, definitely. We've got, as I said, the FIFA Women's World Cup was a joint bid with Australia and New Zealand. So looking at hosting across 13 cities across Australia and New Zealand. I think it sells the strengths of having those locations, and the travel proximity to New Zealand is, quite close to the east coast of Australia. We had the Cricket World Cup, which was Australia and New Zealand back in 2015. And we've had a whole suite of events. And also from an exhibition event point of view, where we've got major teams coming out, it makes sense for them not to just come out and play games in Australia, but also to play them in New Zealand. From a selfish point of view and a New South Wales point of view, we obviously want to maximise the tourism potential and the economic potential for our state. So where we can, we like to host it all in New South Wales. And we've got some great venues across the state. So it's not just Sydney. We've got regional venues, as far north as Coffs Harbour, who've been investing in their infrastructure and their stadia up there. We've got Wollongong and Newcastle as two major hubs. Newcastle's got an international airport that can take flights from New Zealand and does so. So we always look at how we can spread the benefits to regional. The other thing we look at is the legacy in terms of how we can benefit people across regional and New South Wales as well. So that's a much bigger picture when you're doing it across two nations, because you have to look at what New Zealand's looking to get out of it, what Australia's looking to get out of it. But I think we've got a really close working relationship when we do work on those multi-jurisdictional events, not only with our state and other jurisdictional partners, but the federal government, and they work really closely with New Zealand. So it's always an option to be considered, and I think we'll probably see events go more that way when we see those hub models and different split up events. So you do need more cities and more infrastructure. So it may come into play more in the future.
Yeah.
I might just say on the New Zealand one, the FIFA Women's World Cup was a really interesting one because it was the first time that a FIFA event had been hosted across two confederations. New Zealand is based in the Oceania Confederation, and Australia is based in the Asian Confederation. And FIFA's never had an event that's across two confederations, but isn't it fantastic to see? I mean, for the spectator, it makes no difference what confederation people are in. And between our two nations, I think we're going to deliver a fantastic event. But that was a leap of faith for FIFA to see how that would work, because they've got two sets of governing bodies under them. At a national level, they've got two sets of governing bodies at a confederation level, and then FIFA sitting on top. So that'll be a really interesting test case for them, but I wouldn't be surprised if we saw more of that in the future from a whole range of sports.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? And it can also highlight some of the differences in federations and what they're not up to in terms of speed. Just getting back to what you talked about in terms of the regional opportunities that come out of these events, how much of the grassroots activities and sports are really taken into account when it comes to these major events and the flow-on effect for grassroots within the community?
I think it's something as the New South Wales government and in my role at the Office of Sport, it's the first thing we think about. I like to say, what will it give in the back of Bourke? So for those of your international listeners, Bourke's probably one of our far western towns in New South Wales, probably I would say 6 to 8 hours at least from Sydney and from a capital city. What's a kid in the back of Bourke going to get out of hosting a Cricket World Cup or a Rugby World Cup or a Football World Cup? Um, they may not be able to attend the events, it may be too far for them to travel, but we want to ensure there's a legacy for them so they're able to engage in the event, whether that's digitally, but also there's participation opportunities or increased opportunities and increased facilities for them. So we've taken a very practical approach to event legacy here in New South Wales. And for almost all of the World Cups that we work on, we look at developing legacy funding programs and legacy programs to deliver both in the lead up to the event, but also that will leave a lasting legacy post event. So if we look at the T20 T20 World Cup, which is we've hosted the women's, unfortunately the men's been postponed, we established a $6 million legacy fund for grassroots cricket and local councils to apply to improve female participation in programs. So that may be buying equipment so that more girls' teams could play in local areas. There was an infrastructure component which allowed to upgrade cricket nets across regional New South Wales and in metropolitan areas. And then also some funding towards hosting regional events. So we were able to take one of our Big Bash games, which is our professional T20 competition games, to Coffs Harbour, which is 6 hours north of Sydney, to really have a good opportunity to play that in the community. They'd never played a game in regional New South Wales before this year. So those are the sorts of things that we like to do. And then it's also really important that we evaluate those measures. So we work with the University of Sydney, our research partners, to look at the impact of those in the long term, and we work with our state sporting organisations to impact how that has increased their participation or affected their participation. It's a really hard thing to measure because there's so many other external factors along the way. But we know that we are making a difference and that we are improving the quality of facilities, improving access to programs for people across New South Wales. We've got a similar program for the UCI Road World Cycling Championships in Wollongong, and that's focused specifically around Wollongong and the South Coast. So we know that the cyclists in those communities are going to get a benefit out of hosting the event because there is disruption in those communities. You've got to close roads to run cycling events. So at the end of the day, what are they going to get out of it? They're going to get improved facilities. They're going to have more cycling facilities, not just road cycling, but they've got some pump tracks and mountain biking facilities and a real legacy there so that it's known as a cycling community and people want to go there, but the local community can enjoy those facilities as well.
How do you overcome that rejection percentage within the local community who's not the sports-minded person? A lot of people would say, yeah, it's great for our community, it's bringing us facilities, but that's all good for people that are into sport. How do you overcome those negative groups or bodies who say, well, hang on, we're not sports people, there's things that we need in our community way before we need a new sports stadium or a swimming pool or something like that? How do you combat those issues?
I think it's really important to consult the community in the event space. I think when you're looking at just a pure investment against an event versus a piece of infrastructure or roads, rates and rubbish, as we say for local councils, that can be a tough conversation to have. But I think it's around selling the vision of what you're wanting to achieve from the event, being upfront and transparent along the way in the event. So when you announce that an event's coming to a city or a town, you're not going to have all the answers. You take the Olympics, for example, the marathon courses and the road cycling courses don't get set until about 12 months out because there's a lot of work that needs to be done to actually find an appropriate facility to host those types of events. And then also working with your community to source or provide local volunteer opportunities, engage your community groups, so groups like Rotary, which is where you and I met. How can the local Rotary Club be involved? Because if you've got your local community engaged as volunteers, they're going to become advocates of your event. So local organising committees have to work really hard with the local councils and the venue owners and their local stakeholders, their school groups and their community groups to get engaged in that community and be a part of that community. I think the other thing is that you've got to be genuine and be embedded within that community. It's not great if you've got someone setting up an event from halfway across the world and they don't have any interaction with the local community, or they fly out once a year. So having a face on the ground is really important, and having a relationship with the local media and your local key stakeholders and opinion leaders is really important too. So they're probably the key things I would say. You're always going to have people that are unhappy. That's just the nature of life. And the Ironman event you refer to, it's since moved to Port Macquarie, which is just up the road. But I know they say the council know that there's one or two people that every year they're going to get the same complaints. But the fact that they take the time to listen to them and go and spend time with them and give them advance notice of things, that's an example that they may never be happy, but at least they feel like they've been heard too.
Yeah, fair enough. Now, you've talked about the logistics and the process involved in putting these events on. There's an enormous amount of organisation that goes into it. How big is the team that you've got in terms of working on these projects?
So our events team at the Office of Sport is a massive team of 3 people.
3 people?
Yeah, well, currently 2 because I'm on a secondment in the comms team. But yeah, so we've got 3 people. But I think for us in government, we work with a whole range of different agencies. So Destination New South Wales have an events team. They're essentially a marketing agency as well. So they market the state from a tourism perspective and an events perspective. So we lean on their marketing and communications staff along the way. We work really closely with our operational agencies. So in each operational agency, police, transport, New South Wales Health, ambulance and Department of Premier and Cabinet, they've all got event staff as well. And so we have really regular meetings with them. And then from a local organising committee point of view, they establish their own entity to actually deliver the event. So the government is supporting them to deliver that event, but we're often not delivering that event ourselves. It's very rare where we will deliver a World Championships or own that World Championship. So local organising committees can be anything from a few people up to hundreds of people or thousands in the case of an Olympics or Commonwealth Games. I think we're starting to see a shift at the moment that local organising committees are trying to stay as lean as possible for as long as possible, and then just staffing up as they get towards the event. And that means that they can be a bit more agile. It means that they're not losing communication and losing relationships with key stakeholders if there's only a few people working on the event. And from a cost point of view, it obviously brings your budget down. If you haven't employed 10 general managers in your first year, 8 years out from the event, then that's 10 years of budget or 8 years of budget that you're going to save along the way. So that's a really important factor as well.
Okay, cool. Let's go back to the little boy or girl in the back of Burke who's a sports fan, and they see some of these major events coming to town. I'm of the generation that I can remember the Australian Open being played on grass and tennis, and that was a long time ago. And since then, one could say that attending some of these major events has become something of an elitist experience because of the ticket prices. What do you do around ticket pricing to make it affordable for the little kid who's at the back of Burke who really is passionate about basketball, who wants to come along next year and have that experience of a lifetime?
Yeah, I think it's a fine balance because to put on world-class events, obviously you need to make money as well, and tickets is one of your main sources of revenue. A lot of cases, those world events, the international federations hold the rights and the broadcasting, make broadcasting revenue, so you don't really have great opportunity to leverage that. I think lots of local organising committees do a really good job of engaging with community organisations, with their local sporting clubs and their schools to deliver schools programs and community programs where there are those discounted tickets available. I think a lot of them will do that towards the start of your competition, so throughout your group stages, because obviously your premium product is towards your finals and you know that they're going to sell out probably regardless of what prices you put on them, especially in the case of an Australian Open or a World Cup event. But for me, growing up as a kid, I went to the Olympics and the Paralympics, and I know for the Paralympics, I think it was free ticketing for school kids. There was a significant allocation, and I got to walk around. I got to see so many sports on the day, and I didn't care whether it was a group stage or a final. I got to meet athletes and get autographs signed and get a photo. I think that was an incredible experience for me and something that really inspired me to get involved in sport. So I think there is so much benefit in those school programs. And also something that they do really well is they also look at education and how it aligns with curriculums for schools as well. So it's not just coming to watch a match, but is there an education component? And that's something that Sydney Olympic Park can do really well. They've got education programs around the wetlands, around the facilities. They do venue tours as well. So you can come and have a whole day, and the sport is just one component of that, but it's part of your overall experience. So I think working with charity partners as well is something that a lot of local organising communities do. So leveraging their charity partners to provide opportunities is something that also makes events more accessible for people that may not be able to afford that premium product.
Yeah, right. That's good to hear. We couldn't get too much further into the show today without talking about COVID-19. It's unfortunately, had an impact on lots of people's lives and jobs. Let's start off by talking about your fellow colleagues in the city of Tokyo who have gone through a pretty major upheaval with having to postpone. I think it's only the second time in history of the Olympics that it's been postponed twice. What are they having to deal with there? Because it's just a minefield of shifting issues, isn't it, really?
Yeah, it's not one that I'd like on my plate, that's for sure. I guess for an Olympics, it's such a critical time program that so many things post-event need to be shifted. So probably one key consideration is the athletes' village. So a lot of developers would work on building the athletes' village. They're expecting, come the end of the Olympics and the Paralympic Games, they can convert those into units and sell them or lease them off, and potentially have done contracts for those already. So that's one thing that they need to consider in terms of moving them back. Venue handback. So as we said, we talked about the significant amount of temporary overlay and infrastructure that needs to go into these venues. Those venues would have been looking to create a pipeline of events and activities as we go through into 2021. Those events now don't exist anymore, or they need to be moved. And so there's a lot of negotiations with international federations. From a sporting competition point of view, every international federation runs on the Olympic cycle that's involved in the Olympics or the Paralympic Games. So they schedule their World Championships and their Confederational Championships based on that 4-year cycle. So a lot of them would have had events in 2021, or they wouldn't have had events in 2020 because of the Olympics. That whole cycle has shifted now. So funding for those sports becomes very different if they have to move a World Championships from 2020 into 21 or into 22. So there's just a whole minefield. And then that's even before we get to broadcasters, and they've got massive contracts, and the fact that they've now shifted that, they program their broadcasting on having it in 2020 every 4 years. Spectators, we don't know whether they're going to be there, whether they're not, how many there's going to be, whether they're going to be wearing masks, how they're going to be screened. They have to run so many scenarios of that. And contingency planning. What happens if we have a second wave go through Japan the week before the Games? What happens if we don't have a vaccine? What happens if an athlete picks it up and, we've got 10,000 athletes, it spreads throughout the village? How do we protect against that? They're just some of the things. I'm sure I've missed hundreds of things that they're all considering at the moment. But, what a challenge. But if they manage to pull it up, I think if anyone's well-positioned to do it, I think the Japanese and Tokyo are well-positioned. They're very systematic in their planning, and they would have been well-planned down the path. And I'm sure they have contingencies in place for some of these things, but I don't think anyone could have predicted what we've seen this year.
You talked about some of the things there that they're faced with in terms of heading into 2021. Even making that call to postpone it for a year was a big call for all the reasons you've said. Given where we're at, given your experience in the event space at this global level, can it actually go ahead next year? I just can't see how they can do it. Even if we get a vaccine, we're talking about a lead-in time before the whole global population's got it. International travel hasn't even started yet. Athletes training and getting them to peak and taper and all the things that they have to go through. And as you say, if the virus breaks out in the athletes' village, boom, it's all over, right? So can you really see it going ahead next year?
Yeah, I'm the eternal optimist. I think they're doing a really good planning at the moment around the event. I know they've done some test events with larger crowds for their domestic baseball league. I know they've been testing screening. I know they're considering things around how they do provide quarantine or health hubs in the athletes' village so they can minimise that risk. I think we're starting to see sport return to normal. I know here in Australia we're seeing crowds at half capacity and some fuller stadiums in some other states as well. And I think we've seen that the quarantine bubbles and the quarantine protocols we can put in place for athletes to keep them safe is seeming to work so far. So it'll be an Olympics unlike anything we've ever seen. I don't know if we're going to see international spectators travelling or a significant portion of international spectators travelling, but I think from an operational point of view, they'll be able to deliver. I just think it will be with less crowds and a lot more protocols in place than we would normally see. Whether that takes away from the prestige of the event, I think we're yet to see. I know we were watching the Bathurst Supercars race, the Bathurst 1000, which is a major motorsport event here in New South Wales and in Australia a couple of weeks ago, and they only had 4,000 people on site. Normally they'd have 50,000 people. Everyone camps. The top of the mountain where the drivers drive around just packed full of people, and it was a very surreal feeling on the broadcast. And I don't think broadcasters like broadcasting empty stadiums, even though it might have been a few eyeballs on TV. So I don't know how I'll feel about it when we get to it. I hope we see some level of crowd, and I hope we get to see all the events go ahead as planned or as replanned. But time will tell. I think this next 6 months is really critical. But I think if they were going to cancel it, they probably would have cancelled it earlier this year. I don't think they would have postponed it if they weren't confident of getting the games up.
Okay. I've got to tell you, though, a little bit of a pet hate of mine is seeing cardboard cutouts of people in the crowds to try and make it look like there's people sitting in the stadiums. I can't stand that when you see that on television, yeah?
How do you feel about the fake crowd noise, though? I know that's a bone of contention for some.
Well, I've actually talked to some of the athletes that have experienced it, and they think it's quite cool. Because they say when they're in the field of play and they're really in the zone of doing what they're doing, that kind of noise is more peripheral noise to them. And to have something there rather than nothing is really different. I've also spoken to some that have played in front of empty stadiums that didn't have the noise, and they just said it's really eerie and amazing. You can hear the opposition calling out their code words and their what they're going to do in the next play and all that, where normally you wouldn't hear any of that stuff, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I was a bit of a skeptic of the piped-in crowd noise on the broadcast, but I've actually come to enjoy it, and I think they've done a good job of actually matching the noise to what is happening.
Yeah.
I think the NBA did a really good job with the virtual big screens, and they had the fans sort of sitting there watching over right behind the benches. I thought that was a really cool initiative that they did as well. So, I can appreciate it. I've been in a stadium when it's empty and you can call out across it and everyone can hear what you're saying. So having 26 people out on the park or 30 people out on the park running around with no crowds definitely is an interesting feeling that probably not many of them have felt for a long time if they've been playing in their national teams or professional teams for a few years now.
Yeah. It's an interesting time, and I guess as we've seen across a lot of other businesses and industries, companies are adapting to the new world under COVID-19. Let's bring it back to a local level, New South Wales and Sydney in particular. How's COVID affecting sport there? How's it going to affect some of these events that are in your pipeline?
Yeah, we've had to move a couple of events already. So the T20 Men's World Cup is due to be played right now, actually. I think I keep seeing calendar invites popping up for match days that we would have been working at. So that's been postponed to 2022, which is obviously a national event for us. So having to reschedule that to 22. We had the World Cross Country Championships scheduled for Bathurst in regional New South Wales coming up in March 2021 next year. And the local organising committee has put forward to World Athletics to propose postponing that just due to the athlete quarantine issues they're predicting around that time. From a local events point of view, a lot of our professional sporting codes were able to get back to playing in front of no crowds or limited capacity crowds quite quickly because the way our legislation was written, they were considered to be employees, so it was their workplace. But it was with fairly strict biosafety protocols in place, so quarantine for athletes. We've also had the challenge here in Australia that, which we don't normally have, is that we've had borders closed between our states and territories. So normally there's free travel and you can travel wherever you like. But because the cases have been at different levels, especially down in Victoria in the south, they had an outbreak at the end of June, which really spiked up. They had their borders closed. New South Wales is the biggest state, which took a lot of the international travellers, has had ongoing case numbers, predominantly in quarantine. And so whereas some of our other more remote states that don't have travellers coming in, such as Western Australia, the Northern Territory, have had next to no cases. So navigating that in our professional sporting landscape has been really interesting to get our teams. We've had a lot of our Victorian teams have had to base themselves up in Queensland in the north of the country to basically live up there for 5-6 months, which is really hard. They're away from families and one day they got on a plane and they didn't know what day they were going to be coming back, and they've been there for half a year. So that's been a real challenge. We are starting to get back to normal. We're at limited capacity in our stadiums, but one area we're probably hurting at the moment is in our mass participation events, where we're not seated or ticketed. So our running events, cycling, triathlons, those sorts of things, because at the moment it is just too risky, based on the health advice, to have so many people come together, all stand on a start line or congregate and be using common facilities. Whereas in a stadia, it's a bit more controlled. You've got more facilities for people to access, and you can ticket, and you've got better contact tracing ability. So I think we're on the way back up. The New South Wales government's got a major events task force that isn't just looking at sporting events, but cultural events and community events as well, and looking at how we can get them back on their feet as quickly as possible. So we have had a few events go ahead, and a few festivals are starting to plan for 2021, which is really positive because it has really decimated our events industry here, our suppliers and event staff, and community sport all the way up to professional sport. I've seen significant staff stood down or lose their jobs, which is really heartbreaking. People losing their jobs across all industries, but knowing people in the industry that I work in sport and recreation, that's been really hard to see. So fingers crossed that we keep heading in the right direction in Australia, and they do find a vaccine and we can get back to normal. But at the moment, it is trending towards the positive, which is good.
Yeah, it's good to hear that trajectory is in the right way. It's going to take time, as we've talked about in the rest of the show, and there's so many things that need to be considered. And, if there's another outbreak, it sets us back again, so we need to be careful. Phil, we've rushed through our time today. It's been fantastic talking to you and getting a really good insight into how these major sports events are developed within the state of New South Wales. I'd really like to thank you for joining me today. But before I let you go, I'd like to get a prediction on a major sporting event that's happening this weekend in Sydney. The All Blacks are here playing against the Australian Wallabies in the third match of the Bledisloe Cup series. The All Blacks are winning the series 1-0 at the moment after their last weekend win in Eden Park, the fortress of Eden Park in Auckland. We now come to the big stadium in Sydney, and what's your prediction for the weekend? Are the Wallabies going to get up against the All Blacks?
Well, I actually do a sporting podcast, which we recorded earlier this week, and I tipped Australia, so I think the Wallabies are going to bounce back. It's always tough going to Eden Park. I don't think we've won there since 1986, so we probably predicted we were going to lose that one. But the good news is, for those that don't follow rugby, there's 4 games in this series, and we drew the first one, so we've only got to win 2 this time to win, whereas normally it's a 2-game series, and once we lose one, we don't retain the Bledisloe Cup. So I'll back the Wallabies in for this one, and then off to Brisbane the following week for the final one. So hopefully we're still in the hunt for the Bledisloe Cup. I've got friends his daughter is 16 and she's never seen Australia win a Bledisloe Cup. So fingers crossed that we can finally get 1-1 and our friends' children can all enjoy that.
Well, look, mate, I wish you all the very best. I don't hold out too much hope for you, but there is probably a glimmer of hope is that the Wallabies have a New Zealand coach nowadays. So if anybody's going to get them across the line, it's going to be a Kiwi. So good luck for you in the weekend.
Yeah, now we get it done, mate. As long as we get it done, that's the main thing.
Listen, thanks for joining me on the Global Sports Channel today. It's been great having you here and catching up with you after so long, and thanks for sharing all your expertise in the space of managing major sports events.
No problems. Thanks for having me.
There we are. Phil Wishart joining me from the New South Wales government in Australia, and he's got a really interesting job, hasn't he? Organising some of the major world sports events and trying to attract them to New South Wales. I hope that gave you a bit of an insight as to how that process happens and some of the many, many different topics that they have to cover to make sure that the legacy of these events is something that obviously helps the community at large. So there we go. That's the latest episode from the Global Sports Channel. I hope you liked it. Don't forget to connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. And also, you're probably watching this on our YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the little bell there as well, because next time we drop a video, you will be notified. So thanks very much for watching and tuning in today to the Global Sports Channel. I'll be back again soon. My name's Mark Philpott. Until then, have a safe, happy and healthy week ahead.